For decades, we were told one thing about our diet. Saturated fat is going to clog your arteries and it's going to kill you. Don't eat saturated fat. But what if that weren't true? What if we weren't being fed the wrong food, but actually were being fed the wrong advice? So today, we're diving into a brand new 2025 meta-analysis that just dropped, and it challenges one of the most deeply rooted beliefs in nutrition. So the study was led by Yamada and colleagues, and they reviewed only randomized controlled trials, which makes a huge difference. They didn't waste their time on these observational studies. And they found no benefit to restricting saturated fat when it comes to cardiovascular death, all-cause mortality, or heart attacks. So this meta-analysis looked at randomized controlled trials with over 13,000 participants. And these aren't just food surveys or questionnaires. These are controlled experiments. So here's what they found. No reduction in cardiovascular mortality, no reduction in all-cause mortality, no reduction in heart attacks or coronary events. In short, restricting saturated fat had no significant benefit for the outcomes that mattered the most. So the study authors said, the findings indicate that a reduction in saturated fats cannot be recommended at present to prevent cardiovascular disease and mortality. And this isn't just some blog or some fringe journal. This is a 2025 meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, the highest level of clinical evidence that we have. Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's just one study. Maybe it was a fluke. Plus, they only looked at cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality. I've heard that saturated fat increases the risk of cancer. Okay, let's zoom out. Another paper by the prestigious Cochrane Review in 2020, which is often cited by organizations like the WHO and the American Heart Association. They looked at over 59,000 participants, and even that review found that restricting saturated fat intake resulted in no benefit for cardiovascular death and also all-cause mortality, cancer, diabetes, blood pressure, HDL, or triglycerides. And despite finding no benefit of all those things, they dug deeper and they did manage to find a small benefit in restricting saturated fat in reducing combined cardiovascular events, things like non-fatal heart attacks, but the absolute benefit was tiny. In fact, 56 people need to restrict saturated fat for 4 years to prevent just one non-fatal event. And remember, that's a non-fatal event, right? So that's not going to reduce cancer or all-cause mortality or cardiovascular death. So that's not really a compelling case for universal restriction of saturated fat. But let's zoom out a little further. A major 2020 review published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is a publication of the American College of Cardiology, they directly challenged this foundation of the current dietary guidelines. So here's what they wrote. The recommendation to limit dietary saturated fatty acid, or SFA, intake has persisted despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Most recent meta-analysis of randomized controls and observational studies found no beneficial effect in reducing saturated fatty acid intake on cardiovascular disease and total mortality, and instead found a protective effect against stroke. Now, that's not some fringe opinion, right? That's from the publication of the American College of Cardiology in a major review that synthesized the most recent randomized and observational studies. And they concluded the evidence no longer supports limiting saturated fat from the diet. Now, I could go on and on. There's so many studies like that, but let's just take one more in 2022 in the European Journal of Cardiology, where they reviewed all the available literature and they concluded findings from the studies reviewed in this paper indicate that the consumption of saturated fatty acid is not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease risk, events, or mortality. Based on the scientific evidence, there is no scientific ground to demonize saturated fats as a cause of cardiovascular disease. I mean, again, like I said, I could go on and on. There's so much of this, but I don't want to bore you. And yet, despite the evidence, the US Dietary Guidelines for Americans in 2020 to 2025 still recommend limiting saturated fat to less than 10% of daily calories. And these US dietary guidelines aren't just theoretical, they shape school lunches, hospital menus, nursing homes, military rations, you name it. So this outdated advice is still affecting millions of people every day. And where do they get the idea that saturated fat should be limited? Well, here's where it gets tricky. A lot of the pro-saturated fat restriction advice is based on observational studies, not randomized controlled trials. So take this 2021 study. It's a prospective observational study that found a modest link between saturated fat and mortality. But as I said, it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, right? And so its conclusions are vulnerable to what we call confounding factors and bias, which can result in massive flaws. In observational studies, you see errors like recall bias, right? And with recall bias, there's a bias in remembering what you ate last year. So when researchers ask you, for example, how much butter did you have last year? Like, I'm just gonna guess. It's not a great way to collect data. Secondly, there's confounding factors like something called the healthy user bias. Now, the healthy user bias happens when people who are very health conscious, they generally follow common health advice, right? Like avoid red meat and saturated fat because that's what we were told to do. But because they're so health conscious, they also tend to do a lot of other health conscious things, like they might exercise more, smoke less, drink less, manage their stress, have better access to healthcare. So if the outcomes look better, it's not necessarily because of the reduction in saturated fat. It may just be because they live a healthier lifestyle overall, right? Meanwhile, those who ignore mainstream health advice, like they drink sugary beverages, they eat ultra-processed foods, they avoid regular medical care, maybe they're drinking like a liter of Coke every day, that makes it difficult to isolate saturated fat as the culprit. So when a study says people who eat more saturated fat have worse outcomes, it's really hard to know whether or not it's the saturated fat or everything else that came with it. Take this 2002 study on British vegetarians. The researchers found that vegetarians had lower mortality than meat eaters. And the authors talked about the healthy user bias quite clearly. They wrote, quote, British vegetarians have lower mortality compared to the general population. Much of this benefit may be attributed to the non-dietary lifestyle factors, such as low prevalence of smoking, a generally higher socioeconomic status, or other aspects of the diet other than the avoidance of meat and fish. In other words, it's correlation, not causation. And that's why we lean on studies like the ones that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the ones that pretty much exclusively look at randomized controlled trials. They try to separate the signal from the noise. And that's also why we have to be very cautious when interpreting headlines like saturated fat is bad for you. And things get even worse if you think this is just some innocent misunderstanding. Think again. A 2016 paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association by Kearns et al. Exposed internal documents from the Sugar Research Foundation in the 1960s. They actually paid Harvard scientists to downplay sugar's role in heart disease and shift the blame to saturated fat. And that was a ghost-written review, and it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1967 without any disclosure of the sugar industry's funding. Now, at the time, the New England Journal of Medicine didn't require conflict of interest disclosures, so the sugar industry's influence went completely under the radar. As the authors of this 2016 Journal of the American Medical Association paper said, the industry-sponsored research that cast doubt on the hazards of sugar while promoting fat as the dietary culprit. So in other words, the narrative that we have all heard that saturated fat is the bad guy, it wasn't just bad science. It was science that was bought and paid for. So where does that leave us now? Well, multiple high-quality randomized controlled trial meta-analysis showed no clear link between saturated fat intake and death, heart disease, or cancer. Also, these claims that saturated fat is the bad guy, they come from flawed observational studies. And history has shown us that financial interests and political interests have influenced dietary guidelines that we're still following today. But again, as I say in most videos, ultimately, these are population-based studies. Your situation is unique and your health is personal. So you deserve better than these blanket recommendations based on outdated and manipulated science. So as usual, don't take my advice for it, use your own judgment and work along with your healthcare providers. So I wish this video could put this argument to bed, but if you like the video, you have to share it so that other people know about it. So hit the like button and make sure that more people see evidence-based health content. And if you want to see more about the science of nutrition, inflammation, and real health optimization, subscribe and stick around, because we need to rethink what we've been told and we need to make better decisions moving forward.